Democrats are turning their attention to third-party presidential candidates. The Democratic National Committee is forming a team. They were putting a team together, guys, to coordinate attacks on third-party and independent contenders.
NBC News reports the DNC has hired a former staffer of former President Barack Obama and Transportation Secretary Pete Buttigieg to oversee, quote, aggressive communications to take on these third-party candidates.
President Joe Biden's allies have also formed a super PAC called Clear Choice. According to the Washington Post, the group will develop, research, test messages, and push headlines to dissuade voters from supporting third-party names such as Robert F. Kennedy Jr. or Cornel West. Democrats say a third-party ticket could splinter their base, opening the door for Donald Trump to win a second term. So what do you make of this, Ameshia? I know the president has been sort of getting a little bit squirrely about the fact that these uncommitted votes gained some steam in the primary races. We had, I think, about 13% in Michigan, and that went up even higher when Minnesota voted in their primary. Do you think that a lot of these uncommitted voters are ultimately going to go back to the Democratic Party, or is this sort of a longer-term concern for the Biden campaign?
Well, I think Michigan's an interesting case because the reason that the uncommitted vote turned out in the way that it did was largely because of the war in Gaza right now.
Right.
And those voters were strategic around not wanting to support Biden until they see some levels of change in Gaza. And most of those are younger voters, diverse voters, voters that I would argue that he needs, particularly in a state that is a must-win for Biden. But beyond that, we have to remember that for uncommitted voters in Michigan, this isn't the first time they've been uncommitted. They were uncommitted. There was a certain percentage that was uncommitted during Barack Obama's race to the White House as well. It didn't change the facts on the ground. It didn't mean that he lost the primary. It didn't mean that he lost the election. He still coasted to actually, go to the DNC and do what he did and become president of the United States. I don't think that that's going to change for Biden either. However, there's a lot to say about the candidates that they're looking at when it comes to third party. Specifically, we know of the RFK issues surrounding a lot of the conspiracy theories and things like that. The fact that his entire family has also basically stepped aside and said, we don't support this either, many of whom have already donated to Joe Biden's campaign and have met with him on the campaign trail as well. RFK Jr. has shown to, by all polls, actually draw Republican voters and draw from President Trump a whole lot more than he would Joe Biden. In addition to that, his funders are conservatives. They're not Democrats.
I'm curious about which poll you're talking about, because the one that I saw actually showed that he took more support from Democrats, which would back up the fact that the DNC is launching this campaign to try to attack RFK Jr. and Cornel West. But I would say, too, that I think the uncommitted vote this time around probably has a little bit more staying power just because of how passionate people are about the Israel-Palestine issue. And Biden doesn't really seem like he wants to decouple American support away from Israel. He's talked about building this pier in Gaza to help deliver aid, but he's also championing a immigration bill in the Senate that would send another $40 billion in aid to Israel. He wants to continue supplying them with weaponry. And for a lot of those uncommitted voters that, we've talked to on the show, I know my normal co-host Jessica Burbank is one of them who is very passionate about the Palestinian issue. And she says, until they call for a permanent ceasefire, we're prepared to continue to keep our support away from Biden. So I think maybe there's a little bit of a difference there between the uncommitted Obama voters or non-Obama voters back in that primary versus what's happening now with Biden, because they have this specific qualm about his policy that he doesn't seem prepared to change anything on. Although we did just see the Democratic Majority Leader Chuck Schumer come out and say that he wants to advocate for regime change in Israel. He wants to get Netanyahu out of office.
And by all polls, Netanyahu is quite frankly very unpopular in Israel anyway. And that was prior to this war starting. I think that what we're going to see is a splinter of the uncommitted vote. Those who are Muslim, those who identify with the Islamic faith, those individuals, I think, will continue up through November and be stalwarts when it comes to what they see happening in Gaza. I would argue that when we see this younger vote, I think that there might be some shifts, particularly because of other things that they happen to prioritize as well. When it comes to women's reproductive rights, for instance, there is a clear delineation between where Republicans stand and where Democrats stand on those issues. And I don't think we're going to see younger people continue to splinter on that. But I would argue that President Biden, even though he has, as previous presidents of multiple parties have done before him, there is a commitment to Israel. And I don't think that that's going to change. However, his posturing and conversation has, particularly as it comes to him essentially wanting to have stipulations to ongoing funding, making sure that he is asserting that too many civilian casualties have occurred in this war on Gaza. I think that it matters. Now, to the extent that younger voters and those who are currently uncommitted, so to speak, are going to take into consideration this political posturing, I don't know. But I do think that his conversation that he's having right now as it relates to Israel is quite frankly a lot different than it was 3-4 months ago. Honestly, quite different than it was even a month ago around him calling out Netanyahu, him saying, we're going to have a come to Jesus meeting, having these conversations about ways in which you can defend yourself. Israel has the right to defend itself. However, they do not have the right to continue to basically annihilate a population of innocents.
Yeah, and I heard him strike that sort of middle ground during the State of the Union address where he opened with exactly what you said, committing support for Israel and then turning to the loss of civilian lives in Palestine. And I think it's interesting to see what happens with this third-party move and these attacks on the third-party candidates. I mean, my concern would be from a political strategy standpoint, if you have these people who are sort of already looking at people like RFK Jr. and Cornel West because they feel like they're anti-establishment or they have some parts of their platform that maybe the two parties don't talk about as much, that if they start seeing the DNC and the party machine attacking them, maybe that drives them further into their arms. Maybe that creates a situation where they feel like they want to find out more about these candidates and maybe just draws more attention to their cause.
Yeah, so Amber, one of the other big issues related to this is ballot access. We know that it's going to be extremely hard road for any third-party candidate, particularly looking at RFK, also looking at Cornel West, to even get on the ballots in some of these primary states. I think that's going to greatly affect, whether or not they actually pick up any real steam. In addition to that, we don't really know well, I would argue that No Labels kind of flopped already, but they've tried to court Nikki Haley. They tried to court Tim Scott. They tried to court Ron DeSantis. They've tried to court, I don't think anybody was courting Dean, but they've tried to court so many people here. Joe Manchin. And everybody's basically said no because they don't want to get discarded by the actual two major political parties. They're looking towards 2028, if anything else. What do you think about that?
No, I completely agree. I think it's honestly more of a vanity project than anything else. And I think it tells you a lot that they only wanted to get involved if it were a Trump-Biden rematch, right? Because if you are really concerned about the two-party system, you want to create ballot access for third-party candidates, you want to be able to give voters a different option than what they traditionally have, that shouldn't be contingent on whether or not you like the two people who are running as Republicans and Democrats. So I always found this whole project to be fairly ridiculous. They also lost Larry Hogan. I know they were talking about that a lot, and he's now running for Senate in Maryland, which could be a potential pickup for Republicans. That was a huge get for the Republican Party. So I don't even see who they could have running for them at this point that would really make them a viable third option. I wanted to go back for a second as well on who the third-party candidates are that the DNC is going after. Because, as I was alluding to, I think it's possible that if they give too much attention to these other options, that they end up having people discovering things about these candidates that they actually like. For example, a bunch of people started supporting RFK Jr. after he appeared on a couple of podcasts, whether it was Theo Vaughn or Joe Rogan. And so the DNC has to be careful because if history tells us anything, it's that the more people hear about RFK Jr. and the issues that he's talking about, which are issues that aren't traditionally discussed by the major two parties, they kind of like what he has to say.
The most interesting thing I find about RFK Jr. is that he is running a campaign that is outside of the traditional media apparatus. Most of the conversations he's having are with podcasters. They are of a digital nature. He's not sitting down and doing NBC News on the weekends. He's not, doing CNN. He's not doing Fox. Like, you name it, he's not really having those conversations with mainstream media. I think that is a purposeful thing for him. In addition to that, both RFK Jr. as well as Cornel West have some significant issues related to their campaign structure and themselves. Cornel West owes hundreds of thousands of dollars in child support to 6-7 different women. He has, a tax burden that's really high because he has not paid and has skipped taxes for several years. This is an individual who, speaking from the Black community perspective, he was essentially a historian. He was somebody who was looked up to for quite some time. His time has passed. Many people would argue, self included, that when we saw him not really be able to utilize that in the ascendancy of Barack Obama, because he tried it then as well. That was basically dead for him. Cornel West is someone who, as a theologian, for lack of a better term, had that era in the 80s, possibly the majority of the 90s. By the early 2000s, his popularity had tended to dim anyway. It's 2024. The same people he could have brought to the table in 1997 aren't coming to the party in 2024. And I think that he's going to have a harder time there. In addition to the fact that the man has switched parties at least 4 times now. Like, I don't even know what he's a party of at this point, because he continually jumps from one thing to the next, hoping to gain traction.
Yeah, what exactly was it about him that caused the support for him to sunset in the late 90s?
That's a really good question. I think part of it was other people rose. It's almost like pop stars. You grow in time, and then there's the next young hot thing that's able to push themselves on social media, digital capacity. He never really got into that. I think that he lost some people with that process. It was also that he was a breakaway artist for the most part. He was seen as somewhat of an agent of chaos. He decided to do things that weren't necessarily collaborative, coalition building, and he went all out, to be honest, on an anti-Obama campaign in 2008 when Obama was actually really popular, and I think that really hurt him. Yeah,
it's an interesting point about how, as leaders get older, they should step aside and make way for young blood, because it's unfortunately kind of the opposite of what we're seeing with the 2 major parties now, where it seems like all of the leaders keep getting older and older and are very unwilling to let new blood come in. And when they do, it's sort of their handpicked successor. So definitely interesting point there. And thanks for shedding more light on Cornel West, because I know a lot of our viewers don't really know much about him. So thanks for that. Stick around. I'm going to tell you what is on my radar next.